Hello everyone, I'm Margot Beasley. I'm chair of the Blackheath History Forum. First, I'd like to say as our preliminary acknowledgement of country that Blackheath is located in the country of the Darug and Gundungurra peoples, and the Blackheath History Forum recognises that Darug and Gundungurra traditional owners have a continuous and deep connection to their country, and that this is of great cultural significance to Aboriginal people, both locally and in the region. We pay our respects to elders past and present and recognise the strength, capacity and resilience of past and present Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the Blue Mountains region. Okay, so today I want to welcome everyone who's tuned in today. I think this is now the 5th of the Blackheath History Forum's 2020 season of online presentations. Online is a new thing for us, but it seems to be going very well. We're all rather pleased. If you want to ask questions or make comments, please follow the instructions that should appear on the far right of the screen. We also have some instructions on our website at the top of the 2020 page. It's a little bit of mucking around, but it's not terribly hard once you get into it. So today I'm delighted to introduce Lynette Russell, who's sharing the screen with me at the moment, who is an Australian Research Council Laureate Professor at Monash University in Melbourne, from which lockdown city she is beaming into all of us today. Lynette is an anthropological historian specialising in Australian Aboriginal societies, and she's written many books. Today, she's going to talk to us about her enthusiasm for interdisciplinary collaboration with scientists, linguists, and geneticists, amongst other things. This is a fairly rare thing in the world of scholarly history. And as well as that, she's going to introduce us to her beautifully illustrated volume, the award-winning Australia's First Naturalists, Indigenous Peoples' Contribution to Early Zoology. This book was a collaboration with an acclaimed zoologist, Penny Olsen. I'll just show it to you here. All of those who are interested, as I'm sure everybody is, if they've already tuned into this talk, I think you could get it at all good bookshops. It is beautifully illustrated and very much worth a look. So Lynette, we're sorry we can't see you in person on this beautiful spring day in Blackheath, but thank you for agreeing to speak to us online. So take it away, Lynette.
Thank you very much, Margot. I'm going to share my screen as we discussed. Screen 2. And I believe you should be able to see it now. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. And I really do look forward to this, certainly the conversation at the end. Over the last 30 years, a hallmark of my historical career, my publications and my research has been to work in an interdisciplinary space. I've always chosen to be situated in a School of Indigenous Studies or a Centre for Indigenous Studies rather than a School of Historical Studies. This has seen me collaborate with archaeologists, archival systems scientists, linguists, geneticists, and as we just heard, most recently the zoologist Penny Olsen. What I'd like to do in this talk is talk a little bit about how working with these people has enabled me to create a much more complete and nuanced picture of the past, and despite the many, many pitfalls of working with different knowledge systems. And in addition, all of my work has sought to document agency, to reveal Indigenous agency and Indigenous knowledges. As a writer who traces her heritage to both sides of the frontier, both convict and Aboriginal, I've often used this as a lens to explore early Aboriginal-European interactions that run the full gamut from violent and hostile to domestic and familial. A key concern in all of my work is how we know what we know. I'd like to stop at this point and say thank you to Margot for that really lovely acknowledgement of country. So often acknowledgements of country are unsatisfying and cursory. I'm talking to you today from the unceded lands of the Kulin Nations, Naarm, which we now know as Melbourne. But I'm going to ask you to imagine me sitting here in my home in inner Melbourne, that beneath the kilometres of coaxial and an entirely inadequate NBN cable, tons of concrete, mountains of steel, every footfall that we take is on Aboriginal land. And I say Aboriginal because I have not yet had the opportunity to work on Torres Strait Island lands. Where there were once streaming tracks, today we have tram tracks, bike lanes, walking paths and roads. Beneath the buildings sits the very land on which Aboriginal people have lived for tens of thousands of years, since time immemorial. Perhaps 3,000 generations, mother to son, father to daughter. They, we, lived, thrived and survived. Born here, died here, buried here, practiced ceremonies here, hunted, fished and gathered here, built our homes here. They told the stories of the night skies, the seasons, the change over time, yearly events. They traded high-quality quarried stone across great distances and wove baskets and eel traps, decorated magnificent possum skin cloaks with ochre designs which told the story of an owner's life, cloaks that in time became a burial shroud. They saw droughts and floods, practiced fire stick farming. They cared and managed for the landscape, ensuring that they benefited from its bounty. They watched the sea level rise and create Port Phillip Bay. They saw the Birrayung, which is now known as the Yarra, flood and retreat, and there, where it once wound its way across the plains, is now a shipping lane. And through all of this, the countless generations, thousands of stories, they maintained an unbroken connection to country, a connection that has never, ever been broken, that is tested at times indeed, but never broken. It is to all of those ancestors, the Kulin Nations and my own, the Watchbullock from Western Victoria, that I acknowledge, that I respect and who I am guided by and whom I try to listen to. This is what I want you, everyone, to hear when I make an acknowledgement of country. And this is the imagining that I'm going to ask you all to do as you listen to my approach to history. When Richard White first invited me to be part of the Blackheath History Talks, I was thrilled. I had imagined a weekend in the Blue Mountains, a day or two before, after with my son who lives in Sydney, a break from the constant metropolis hum and general craziness of the normal cosmopolitan life of Melbourne. Sure, I'd heard of COVID-19. I'd been in London in late January as the British Airways announced they were cancelling travel to Wuhan in China. Tentatively, Richard and I corresponded, and it became clear that we were going to be on the safe side, and the event would not go ahead as planned. It's actually hard to imagine now, but it is the 214th day that I have been in lockdown here in Melbourne. Nearly 40 million people across the planet have been diagnosed with the virus, and more than 1 million of them have died. Those of us who study history are daily reminded of the 1919 influenza pandemic, the aftermath of both world wars. I recently had the privilege to listen to a PhD student doing a historical research on the HIV AIDS epidemic of the 1980s. The stories were so familiar, and the pandemic today became so very real. It might be a distant memory now for most of us, but I can certainly recall adults who grew up in a pre-vaccination era where children contracted polio, leaving them with wizened legs and often a shortened lifespan. So as we talk about flattening the curve and the preferred models of social distancing, isolation and lockdown, I would suggest that history has never been more important. And while the media might tell us we're in uncharted terrain, as historians, we would argue otherwise. Throughout all pandemics, discussions around medical versus economic fraternities dominate. Never has there been a more pertinent time for the humanities, for social science scholars to be heard, and yet we are almost invisible. And certainly we are inaudible. I'm going to argue that history, in my case, interdisciplinary history, has never been more important and never been more urgent. But what do I mean by interdisciplinary history? The work I do seeks to link historical methods, archives, material culture, visual images, along with sociological theory, anthropology, archaeology, and much more recently, hard science, genetics, and zoology. My motivation for this is for a fuller picture, a much more rich, textured picture of Australia's Indigenous past. I want to show Aboriginal people not merely reacting, but acting. I want to tell stories about history that are alive, aware, and imaginative. And I caution here, when I say imaginative, I don't mean imaginary. I recently had a senior historian take me to task for using the term imaginative, thinking I was somehow writing fiction when I'm not. When I first started working in this area about 30 years ago, I would ask my students to name 10 Australian and 10 American tribes. This was a really interesting experiment because invariably they were able to answer the question of the 10 American tribes quickly and easily, but often they struggled with the Australian tribes. That's simply no longer the case. There used to be a sense that Aboriginal people were all the same, but today we speak of, as this IATSIS map demonstrates, 250 different languages and 600 different tribal or social groups. This map represents the porous boundaries, the multitude of group dynamics that took place across our entire continent and island Australia. And for many, there might still be a sense of timelessness as we talk of 65,000 years of occupation. It's often difficult to conceive such deep and ponderous aeons. Archaeologists are very good at reminding us of dates, locating objects, artefacts, manuports, food remains, but sometimes it's valuable to think about what life was like back then, to imagine a little. Mudgebibi, much in the news, a sandstone rock shelter in Arnhem Land in Northern Territories, Australia, is said to be the oldest site of human habitation in Australia, dated to 65,000 years before the present. It's actually the top of the three little cluster of dots in what would now be Northern Territory in this map here, which is in fact a map of Greater Sahul, because when Mudgebibi was occupied, that's what Australia looked like. When I read and digest scientific papers about Mudgebibi, what jumps out at me is the utterly recognisable materials, artefacts and food remains, and in particular, a small ochre crayon. What I see when I think about this remarkable site is that ochre crayon. This might mean art, body decoration, ceremony, decorating artefacts, perhaps bark basins or structures or weapons. I think of music, clapsticks, perhaps children laughing, being cheeky. By taking an interdisciplinary approach, I'm convinced we can produce a much richer, more textured, detailed and colourful story for this continent that is our shared home. I had the opportunity to go back and reread the Mudgebibi paper this morning, and I made the mistake of, as they were saying, don't look at the comments, but I did. I looked at the comments, and I was stunned to discover just this litany of racist and really horrible comments about Aboriginal people and their capacity for change and the rest. Billy Griffiths and I, a couple of years back, wrote a paper on this, showing that these sorts of tropes, these racist tropes, really are tenacious, and they just simply don't want to give up. One of the reasons I'm showing you this picture of the greater island of Australia and Sahul, as it was then, is each one of those dots represents a site of more than 40,000 years. Mudgebibi, as I said, terribly important. It's the oldest that we know of, 65,000 years. But I thought I might show you this because you can see that, in fact, the number of sites that are over 45,000 years is actually very small, which is something we need to think about when we consider that it was a 40,000-year-old site that was destroyed by Rio Tinto recently, the Junkan Gorge sites. And I'm never going to miss a chance to evangelise, so I'm doing that now. I trained in archaeology. I trained in archaeology up to my honours year, and it was then that I realised I hated fieldwork. That makes archaeology rather difficult. But what I do love is that deep past, and one of the ways that I've always got into that deep past has been through visual images. Now, lots of archaeologists hate this particular image of life at Lake Mungo. I love it. I love it because it shows a thriving community. And today, of course, the Barkindji and Muttamutti people and the Nyapinbi people, Lake Mungo, continue to live their lives, not at the lake now, as it is there, filled with water, but of course they still live on that land and still have custodianship of that country. The opportunity of working with archaeologists and environmental scientists is something that's come to me through my collaboration with the Centre of Excellence in Biodiversity and Heritage. I'm the Deputy Director of the centre, which is based at the University of Wollongong, its primary node, and we have nodes across Australia. At that centre, as I said, I'm a Deputy Director, and I'm one of the very few, in fact, I suspect I am the only historian. It's such a valuable opportunity for us all to talk and to speak, scientists to humanities scholars to social scientists, to really get to the bottom of how do we tell the great epic story of Australia. I put that slide there, so I hope you might log in and have a look at our website, because there's a lot of really interesting, beautiful material in there. Quite recently, through our collaboration in the Centre of Excellence, I've had the opportunity of working with some genetics researchers, and we started to think about whether or not it was possible to document Aboriginal people's occupation just through the soil. Can we pick up human DNA, environmental DNA? Can we demonstrate people's activities? And this was in particular, we were interested in whether or not we might be able to support the claims for birthing trees and having these saved as part of a really distressing development that was happening here in Victoria. We've actually got a paper coming out in Nature in a couple of weeks' time, which I suspect I'm one of the very few historians who've had that privilege. But again, looking at the collaboration between geneticists, genetics researchers, and people like myself, who is a definite humanities scholar. So this brings me to the writing of first naturalists. For the longest time, first naturalists was called first zoologists in my head. When approached by Susan Hall from the National Library with an offer to co-author a book with natural history writer and zoologist Penny Olsen, I was in equal parts honoured and chuffed. Penny's an author I'd long admired, and indeed I'd bought numerous copies of her upside-down world, early European impressions of Australia's curious animals, as gifts for family members. The other thing is the quality, and indeed, as was just mentioned, the quality of the National Library books has always impressed. The invitation from Susan and Penny came at the same time that my good friends John Maynard and Victoria Haskins had published their wonderful book, Living with the Locals, Early Europeans' Experience of Indigenous Life. The offer to co-author an NLA book was something I was very keen to do. I have a very strong interest in the 19th century, the contact period and relationships that emerged out of the arrival of newcomers, Europeans, to our land. My passion is for what I call encounter histories. In the early days, I was keen to understand how other families who have ancestors on either side of the frontier might have formed. Over the years, I've become fascinated by life before the arrival of the British. I'm awestruck how over millennia the First Nations have lived, thrived in what are often harsh and inhospitable lands. On my many, many trips with elders across many different communities, I've been shown ecological knowledge, how to harvest gum sap when onion grass was sweetest, where to get the best fish. As a child, my family went hunting regularly, not kangaroo or wallaby, but rabbits. While out hunting, we collected wild vegetables and invariably a crop of mushrooms or two. I could only imagine the knowledge that the original Australians must have had. Seasons, climate changes. Over generations, they would have spoken of the seas rising, the beaches falling. It's not surprising when the opportunity came to think more deeply about this. Penny and I were really excited at the chance. The process of writing this book was interesting. Penny and I didn't know each other at the outset. We needed to find a way to work together. And while we authored individual chapters, we were also really committed to editing, commenting, and amending every word that each other wrote. There can be no place for delicate egos when you're writing a book like this. Hurt feelings just don't have a place here. we were committed to producing a book of which we would both be proud. Penny as a zoologist and a writer, and me as a historian, an Aboriginal person and a writer. We knew we each had our strengths, but we also knew that it was only going to work if it was both of us. When the book was published, I was actually stunned by the reactions. Numerous people emailed, tweeted, Facebooked me, and there seemed to be a real hunger for this sort of interest. As the work of Bruce Pascoe and others is starting to demonstrate, Indigenous knowledge has been undervalued and at times hidden and degraded. It was such a thrill that our book could reveal the depth of formal knowledge that Aboriginal men and women and children had as they collected specimens for museums and collections around the world. The book was a labour of love for me, squeezed in between competing pressures of running a university centre, research and teaching. But in many ways, it was a book that we wrote as an act of reconciliation, a collaboration of Indigenous and non-Indigenous scholars, a celebration of historic and contemporary Indigenous knowledges, and a genuine attempt to get this important story out to as wide an audience as possible. One of the key things that we found, apart from using the beautiful archival records of these relationships and activities, was the extraordinary collection of images that the National Library of Australia has. We are immensely fortunate to have a National Library of the calibre of ours. Its collection is second to none anywhere in the world, and we are very, very fortunate. And I will take my dying breath trying to save it and making sure that it survives. One of this image here is of Lycett using fire to hunt the Aborigines, and I'll return to the story of fire a little bit later on. But some of these images here, I'm really putting them up just for you to get a sense of just the depth of these beautiful illustrations. One of the stories in the book is very poignant, and I find it deeply touching. And I thought it appropriate because it's actually someone from the Darug clan of the Eora Nation, and not quite Blackheath, but almost. It's the story of Daniel Morton. It's known, but little discussed or celebrated. Born around 1791, and unfortunately we don't have any reliable images of Morton or Daniel. Daniel Morton was born around 1791 in the Parramatta district. He was adopted, or perhaps stolen, and then housed as an infant by Richard Partridge, who was the colony's notorious hangman. The Reverend Samuel Marsden described Daniel as a very fine youth. Muwartin, his Aboriginal name, meant bush path, and it's probably a name he received on initiation. At what we think was what today we would think of as a very tender age of 14, Muwartin became the helper for George Cayley, the botanist, employed by Sir Joseph Banks. Daniel was Cayley's interpreter, his bush guide, his plant and leaf getter, his bird trapper, his servant, his companion, and his friend. He lived in Cayley's cottage near Government House, and Cayley mapped eucalyptus leaves and gum nuts that were sent back to England with the words, "Got by Dan." In 1805, Daniel Muwartin sailed with Cayley to Norfolk Island and on to Van Diemen's Land. Then, back in Sydney in 1807, while searching for the koala in the southwest of the settlement, Daniel found a waterfall. Found a waterfall, which Cayley named and sketched as the Cataract of Corongarung on the River Muwartin River, which appeared as Plate 1 in Matthew Flinders' Atlas of Terra Australis. I'm sorry to say that it was renamed a few years later and it no longer carries its Aboriginal name, or its name for an Aboriginal man. Towards the end of the year in 1807, Cayley was distressed to hear a rumour that Muwartin had been speared and killed, and he wrote Banks fully expressing his feelings for his friend. "The native I have been speaking of is the most civilised of that I have known, the best interpreter and of the more inland natives' language than I have met. I can place with confidence in him, which I cannot in any other. All except him are afraid to go beyond the limits of the space, and I know this man would stand with me until I fell if attacked by strangers. His name is Muwartin." To Banks, Cayley wrote that he would like to bring Mowatin to England, apparently as a sort of ambassador. Unlike several of his more closed-minded colleagues, Cayley truly believed that Mowatin was of great value to him as a scientist, and that the Eora had knowledge that was absolutely valuable. He wrote, "It is universally said that natives of New South Wales are the most idle, wretched and miserable beings in the world, but I could single out several that would surpass numbers of Englishmen in mental qualifications, allowing for the difference in opportunity, acquiring them and setting them forth." Not least, Cayley argued, if Aboriginal people were educated, they would be of great value to science. He wrote, "Respecting natural history, we should be made acquainted with many animals at present unknown to us. If there were a ship going on a voyage of discovery, I should strongly recommend such a native to be a naturalist. There would be no danger of the collectors getting lost or bewildered, which is too often the case, for the native would trace their footsteps back. He would likewise foresee whether any danger was to be expected for the native of that part. He would point out the tracks of different animals which would go unnoticed by the Europeans, and many new birds would be readily obtained, as natives in general are excellent marksmen and quicker sighted than us people." Mowatin then sailed with Cayley in the HMS Hindustan in 1810. He spent a year living in London, supported by Banks, dressed in pink clothing, the fashion of the day. He frequented theatres and public houses. He smoked his pipe, having evenings at a Chelsea coffee house. In conversation, he always said that fine shops and cities were not equal to his woods in his home country. Banks gave him a fine gun to continue collecting on his return home. And while Cayley remained in England, Dan sailed for Sydney in the Mary of London with the nurseryman George Souter. After 2 weeks at Souter's Balcombe Hills, Mowatin sold the shotgun given to him by the botanist, bought grog, and disappeared into the bush. The sad story of Mowatin from that point is that he became employed as a labourer. He then was accused of rape and eventually was found guilty and executed, the first legally executed Aboriginal person in the country in 1816. Today, some of the specimens that he collected are in the National Herbarium, the Royal Botanic Gardens, with the words "collected by Dan." In addition to resurrecting the agency and the autonomy of Aboriginal people, we were really keen to individualise them, just as what I'm trying to do here with this little discussion of Mowatin. This is at a time when people were unsure whether or not Aboriginal people were even human. There were conversations about whether or not they could be described as human. But people like Governor Arthur, whose proclamation of the Aborigines in 1828 is illustrated here, were very determined to make sure that Aboriginal people were to be treated the same as white people. Of course, the reality of this was something quite different. Trying to identify the individuals is really very difficult because often the names were given were not their actual names and they often weren't described as what group they came from. So one of the things we had to do was identify the location that people came from and then try and work out as best we could which group they might have belonged to. I've got a couple more images here. These really are to highlight the NLA's magnificent collection. This image that you see now is an image of the Ngiri people delivering specimens at the Mondulum camp, bargaining with Blandowski for a reward. One of the things that is important to remember is that Aboriginal people didn't go on these collecting expeditions and supply the faunal remains, the fauna rather, that became the collections of European and Australian museums. They were paid often, they were coerced often, they were often given what we might not consider to be payment, but clearly they may have. There's a lovely story that Baldwin Spencer tells of children and women just having great delight in the sweets that he was giving them when they'd bring back a new lizard or a small mammal. The competitive Blandowski in this image, you can see, he's drawn himself in quite the heroic pose, Kreft sitting behind him with the taxidermist's apron. As a result of this image and of the work that we've been doing on the zoology and the naturalists, I'm just about to start a new project with a group of scholars in Germany working on von Mueller and Blandowski's collections with historians, museum curators, and again, Aboriginal people, always Aboriginal people. In the next two images, these are particularly rare images because they're actually, the individuals are named. I had attended an exhibition, an art exhibition a number of years ago at an American, it was actually in Washington, and they had images of families with African-American slaves, servants, and they had hung the exhibition so that only the black faces were lit and the rest of the family were in shadow. And I thought it was an absolutely brilliant interrogation and intervention into the ways in which people are named or not named in images. What I love about these images, the first one, this one here, Holm and Dominic, with a jabiru or a swamp pheasant and a crocodile, is that the person is named. Dominic, that's him, that's his name. Here's the next one. And then this one is a famous photograph from Spencer and Gillen, courtesy of the Melbourne Museum. So we've got Frank Gillen and Baldwin Spencer in the front, and at the back there we've got Irakarakia, Jimmy Kite, Harry Chance and Parunda, members of the expedition named and identified. Now I'm going to, in my last sort of 15 minutes, I'm going to talk about how important this knowledge, this faunal knowledge is for contemporary society. And I noticed that your Blackheath history motto is the past for the present, which is precisely what I'm interested in, particularly in of all the years 2020. The first naturalists in lots of ways is surprisingly indeed prescient. This year, we started the year, it's hard to recall now after all this lockdown, but of course we started the year with the most extraordinary bushfires. Since the late 18th century, when Europeans arrived and colonised Australia, of course the landscape has changed dramatically. After millennia of fire stick farming and the periodic burning of the landscape, much of Australia's fauna and flora are fire tolerant. Indeed, many have evolved to thrive in such circumstances. But agriculture and farming and the introduction of hard-hooved animals, along with the destruction of forests and other plants, have led to a massive reduction in Indigenous fauna. Perhaps the most damaging of all has been the release of feral animals, foxes, rabbits, deers, cats, pigs, water buffalo, cane toad, and many, many others. I'm really delighted to say that this week I was fortunate enough to get one of the Australian Research Council's Strategic Research Initiative grants with Fiona Probyn-Rapsey of the University of Wollongong. We're going to be looking at the cultural impacts of introduced animals over the next 3 years. We're going to be using three iconic case studies: brumbies in the Alpine, feral cats, and cattle grazing in Northern Australia. It's estimated that there are over 10 million feral cats, which hunt 400 different native species, literally decimating billions of insects, reptiles, small mammals, and birds' eggs. It's a large agreement that the cat, Felis catus, in particular with the red fox, has decimated the native faunal populations. But of course, in addition, the change in fire regimes has added to this precariousness. Of terrestrial and mammal fauna, 10% of those that thrived here in 1788 are now regarded to be extinct. It's been described as the 6th mass extinction on the planet. Within 60 years of Europeans arriving in Northern Australia, at least 1 or 2 species per decade began to become extinct. Some faunal surveys over the last few years have been, it's very worrying trends for these animal populations. and it's deeply, deeply disturbing. Aboriginal people are actively involved in these surveys. It's a key part of the way in which they maintain and manage their country. These faunal surveys include things like this, as you'll see here, there's a small mammal habitat survey that's taking place on the St Edward Pallow group, and then down below there's a flat-back turtle being measured. Again, we've made the effort to put the names of everybody in there because they're all known to, particularly the photographer, my good colleague and friend John Bradley. This federal government has instituted the Indigenous Rangers program, which is what this is part of. Working on country programs, highly successful, incredibly important career pathways for Aboriginal people, working, not just Aboriginal people, indeed Indigenous people, because Torres Strait Islanders have been working on the same. These are terribly important. They are enabling skill sharing, intergenerational teaching. They certainly mean that there's opportunity to generate income and jobs in environment, biosecurity, tourism and other sectors. At Nhulunbuy, the Indigenous Protected Area, the Yirrkala Land and Sea Rangers undertake a range of activities including managing weeds, fire and feral species, sea country management, removing marine debris. And you might get a chance, I know at the National Gallery and certainly other galleries, the ghost nets are being harvested out of the sea and turned into really beautiful but fragile and precarious art pieces, which remind us of our connection to the natural world. In addition, at the Nhulunbuy and Yirrkala, they operate a bush plant nursery and have started cottage industries such as soaps and creams based on eucalyptus and other flora. And I put this here because I ask you to think the next time you're going to be buying a gift for someone, how can I manage this to actually have a meaning beyond just a gift? Can we also include to be something that maybe gives back to Aboriginal communities? I just bought my son-in-law, I hope he's not watching, I bought my son-in-law some Kakadu plum body lotion for his birthday, which is coming up. I really recommend that this is a way that we can really genuinely give back. The use of traditional ecological knowledge has emerged as a field in anthropology over the last few decades. It's the cumulative body of knowledge and beliefs handed down through generations through cultural transmission. It's about the relationship between people and all living beings with one another and their environment. It is an attribute of societies with historical continuity and resource use. Of course, the use of traditional ecological knowledge has been controversial because it preferences Indigenous knowledge as a baseline for environmental data in locations where there's little recorded scientific data. Animals and their habitats, which communities once knew a great deal about, are becoming extinct or damaged. So by responding to what Aboriginal people know in their country and what they can actually tell you about their biodiversity, we have a chance of resurrecting them. One of the most important things has been the use of fire. I had the opportunity last year to attend, to be on country in Kakadu National Park when they were doing some burning. And I was stunned by the gentle, cool burn. You could see as the burn, just as the flames just gently moved across the landscape, and nothing was harmed, only just the stubble. You could see insects and little reptiles emerge from the grass just moments after the fire had passed through. And the predator birds, hundreds of them circling around because they could see. It was a moment of symbiosis. Of course, the idea of firing our landscape has never been more important. And in fact, we've just been through what has quite simply been the worst bushfire period of our entire living memory. And it's time now that we turn to people like Victor Stephenson, an Aboriginal fire practitioner, who says that we need to get back to firing the landscape in that gentle, cool way that I was just describing as I saw it take place in Kakadu. sorry. So Aboriginal people across Australia using fire as a means of manipulating their landscape. Fire stick farming has always been acknowledged as an effective strategy to increase target species of animals and plants. That regular firing up to clean up the country is important because it can reduce the potential for large, catastrophic hot bushfires, such as we've just been experienced. Changes in traditional firing practice have reduced to a reduction in native species, which is a little counterintuitive, but in fact, our animals have needed the fire. Attempts to reintroduce Aboriginal burning practices are now being trialled. They're being trialled in a number of locations from Tasmania to Northern Australia. And in addition to improving the habitat for native fauna, Aboriginal firing has the potential to contribute economically to Indigenous communities. This was one of the pieces of research that thrilled me the most when I uncovered it. In addition to just burning the country and cleaning it up, according to the anthropologist John Altman, there's a potential commercial value in carbon abatement and sequestration. What's happening is that collaboration between communities and the Cooperative Research Centre for the Tropical Savannas is demonstrating that by using contemporary Indigenous firing regimes, extending them into areas that are currently uninhabited, which focuses on a dry season burning, they can massively reduce the load of carbon in the atmosphere. It took me a long time to understand this, but in actual fact, they are now reducing greenhouse gas emissions from the area by an equivalent of 100,000 tonnes of CO2 each year through strategic firing. And if it wasn't enough just to take the fuel load down so that we can keep our fires at least cool and not as catastrophic and devastating as they were in the last summer, it's a wonderful thing that we might also be able to reduce the overall CO2 load. So while I'm a historian, I'm obviously very interested in the science and scientific practices, and I'm also interested in the interdisciplinary approaches to how we can tell the past. This book was a labour of love. I mentioned that at the beginning. It meant a great deal to me to be able to work with someone of the calibre of Penny Olsen, to work with an organisation of the extraordinary standards of the National Library, but to also work with that incredible material, beautiful photographs, images, wonderful texts, and to be able to show that people came into this country and they really did observe, collect, and engage with Aboriginal people in ways that we maybe didn't realise at first. And just as I was saying before, that I think it's really important that we start thinking about how we might give back to Aboriginal communities. I'm going to finish on this last slide here. This slide here, apart from Kylie Kwong, the chef, that's a photograph of a young man, Corey Tutt. He's a Kamilaroi man, and he set up this extraordinary organisation called Deadly Science. He's committed to getting science knowledge out into schools, and he's very committed to both incorporating Indigenous knowledges, Aboriginal science knowledge, but in addition to that, he is trying to educate both non-Indigenous and Indigenous Australians about the value of science. I'm hoping people might take this opportunity to support Corey in his ventures. It's something that he's done an amazing job. He's got telescopes out there and chemistry sets. He's sending out books by the boxful to remote Aboriginal communities. Some communities didn't even have a library, so he's really making sure that these kids learn about science. And I've been incredibly honoured and touched by him telling me how much First Naturalists has meant to him, and he's made a real effort to give gifts of it to many people, including this one here, which I'm very honoured by, to the incredible Kylie Kwong, whose recipes I've always followed, so now I get to see her holding a copy of my book. So that's all I've got for now. I hope we can have an opportunity to have a few questions. It's a very strange way of doing a talk, I have to say. I can't see anybody's faces, but over to you.
Thank you very much, Lynette. That was really fantastic. And thank you also for the really lovely way that you ended the talk on a more optimistic note, and with that great encouragement to pursue deadly science, which looks wonderful, and not only wonderful but extremely accessible to children of all ages, including perhaps myself, because my own scientific knowledge is not exactly deep. Now, I think if people look at the comments, you will pick up the links both to Epic Australia and to Deadly Science, both of which were mentioned in Lynette's talk. So log on to them if you want to pursue these things a little bit further. That's in the public comments, not in the private chat, of course. So, Lynette, my question, I suppose, just to get the ball rolling on these things, is really about the mystery, what seems a bit mysterious to me anyway, about how a zoologist and a historian work together. You did say in the talk that you wrote different chapters. When you read the book, it's not at all evident that two people have written separate sections. And I wondered what the overall framework was for pursuing and organising the material. Do you start with a zoological framework, or do you start with a, broadly speaking, historical framework?
I think we started. I mean, when I say we certainly wrote, we rewrote everything together. So there's not a word in it that we both haven't, looked at and thought about and edited and re-edited. What we did was, Penny had begun to collect a lot of information about Aboriginal people collecting faunal specimens for the various museum and naturalists and zoologists. So she'd already started that work. And so when we got together, she was able to sort of sit me down and show me a whole lot of material. And then I had a way of getting in. I could easily get in there. It was very interesting. And as I said, and I don't want this to sound in any way other than the way it's meant, with generous, absolutely generous spirit. It can't be to write. I've written books with friends and colleagues and husband, but this is the first time I've written with a complete stranger. And I think if you're going to write with a complete stranger, and I'm delighted to say we became friends through the process, but I think if you're going to write with a complete stranger, you just can't have any room for egos. It's just not going to work if every word you write is so precious that it can't be edited. And neither of us were like that. We were both absolutely open to hearing what the other one said, so that's really how we went about it.
It was quite fascinating. It's a lovely book to read. It's very accessible. The illustrations, as we keep saying, are really extremely special and as informative as the text almost. They certainly are, I guess, contextualised by the text, but it's a lovely book just to sit and flick through. Even if you're not a big reader of that kind of thing, you will enjoy looking at the pictures because they're marvellous quality and marvellous reproduction quality. Now, Kate O'Neill has said, thank you for this fascinating and interesting talk with so many new topics to explore, especially the study on the cultural impacts of feral animals. I know Kate, and she always raises interesting points about our talks. And yes, I think we're probably all looking forward to that one because it's a bit of a current topic, especially cats in the Blue Mountains are particularly problematic. Yeah. I say that as a cat lover, but there's no getting away from the issues around domestic cats, and up here they are very serious, and in all other parts of the Australian continent, I guess.
And the interesting thing...
A question has come, actually... I'm sorry, go on. Yep, go.
I was just going to say one interesting thing is where in some Aboriginal communities where the cat has actually become a totemic animal and has been incorporated into the cosmological view of the world. So,
that's interesting. So, in other words, favourably.
Yes, indeed.
Or not.
favourably. Yeah.
I hope they're the right kind of cats. I hope they're behaving themselves. Okay, there's also an inquiry for the Blackheath History Forum site saying, are recent publications like Tara June Winch's The Yield, all of Bruce Pascoe's work, Grace Carskin's People of the River et al., a change in public awareness of Australia's Indigenous culture?
I believe they are. I feel very strongly that we're in a phase of, I mean, it's a kind of post-reconciliation, and we all know there's problems with reconciliation, but we're in a different phase now. Indigenous knowledge is being recognised and valued. And unfortunately, I wonder sometimes if we had to go through what was almost the Holocaust of those bushfires for people to start realising that the landscape is screaming out at us, that we need to start taking care of it again. We're not going to survive if we don't listen.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, we were particularly badly affected by the fires here, and it's certainly alarmed people in a good way. And the other thing, just about the level of awareness about Indigenous culture and practices and so on, is that we find our audiences at the Blackheath History Forum are very attuned to anything we present, which is about Aboriginal or Indigenous history and any sort of facet of that, and which is a lovely positive sign. Just in general, one would think it's a good thing, but it's also very nice to know that the people who follow the History Forum and turn up in an extremely loyal way to our talks, they are expressing this hunger, and it's great. So I hope some of them are tuned in today. They tend to be a little bit silent after the talks, but I'm sure they'll have loved it as I did. Kate has just added, after our discussion just a couple of minutes ago, she's saying that she agrees that the book really comes across as having authors that are totally invested in it, and the illustrations are fantastic. Now, Emily has written, thanks for a fantastic talk. How common was it for Aboriginal women to work with and help help European collectors?
We do have quite a few women that unfortunately, often they're not named, which is very frustrating, or they're given the, ubiquitous Jenny 1 or Jenny 2 or Mary. But it's really fantastic. There are a number of women. Of course, in traditional society, women are the ones who collect small animals. I mean, the hunting large mammals, that tends to be men's business, but certainly the hunting of the small mammals, the gathering of small animals, the insects, reptiles, that was almost invariably women. So the women were extremely knowledgeable about the various habitats and ecological niches of the different animals. So yes, they did indeed use women to collect for them as well. And Baldwin Spencer has quite an extensive bit where he talks about the women working out very quickly an exchange rate for the lizards and the small creatures, to the point where they start to bargain with him, and he fears he's going to run out of the sweets, which they like very much.
Emily also,
the collectors were men. I mean, we didn't have any women going out doing collecting, European women anyway.
Yes, Emily just mentions that, assuming that most of the European collectors were male. One of the things I liked in the book, which you mentioned very briefly in the talk today, was the children and the sweets, because I can't remember who the European collector was, but he was most annoyed that every time he asked the children to bring back a bunch of small animals for him in return for a sweet or a few sweets, they'd tell, yes, we'll do that, and then they'd come back with one, and he'd have to dole out more sweets. I thought, they learn pretty quickly, small children. I think I can get more out of this one. Yeah. We've talked about all the, you've talked to some extent about ecological destruction. I think not so much about extinction, which was also a bit of a byproduct of Europeans bent on collecting on the Australian continent. And some collectors observed that not only the wildlife was disappearing in some parts of the country as they followed on from other people who may have been through, but those areas were also often being depopulated of humans. So I'm wondering if you could expand a bit on the relationship between the two things, the fauna and the people.
Certainly, a lot of in the more settled areas, say southeastern Australia, Aboriginal people were moved on very quickly onto missions and reserves, and in Australia from the 1840s, in Victoria from the 1840s onwards, it was very difficult for Aboriginal people to continue to move freely across their country, going into the 50s, 1850s and 60s. Of course, with the gold rush, Aboriginal people started to work on properties, primarily because a lot of the farm workers had gone to try their hand in the gold fields. But at the same time, they developed fencing. So once I don't want to call them settlers, but I'll say the squatters came and erected fences, that actually often prevented people from being able to free access across their country, because these fences were often policed. So yes, it depends on where in the country. I mean, certainly in the north, in Central Australia, Aboriginal people managed to stay on their country for much longer. But in southeastern Australia, and as we know, the tragic story of what happened in Tasmania, where people were rounded up and placed at Wyberlena, and of course later on at Oyster Cove, there was depopulation. There was massive loss of life between disease, violence. We know of poisoning. There's a whole range of things that happened. And, of course, there was also venereal diseases which left people infertile.
That's a pretty sure route to a kind of extinction, isn't it? One question I had, two, one very broad, another one a little bit narrower, is whether there's been any detailed research on the economics of the international trade in natural history specimens and Aboriginal artefacts. I just wonder, because you do say at one stage it was actually the main export from Australia was natural history specimens and artefacts. And I just wondered whether, that's quite a big thing. Australia was not an export country for a long time, so that's understandable. But yeah, I wonder if anybody's done any finally
there has been
research
some
on
work. There's been quite a bit of work. I know Robin Torrance and Annie Clark have looked at those sorts of export trades, and Rodney Harrison has done quite a bit of work looking at a particular collector in Sydney who sort of set up what was almost like a gallery of materials and natural history specimens, but also Aboriginal artefacts, and traded them extensively across the world.
My other question is whether it would be possible to write something of this kind from an Aboriginal perspective, something of the kind that this book is, or is it more or less essential to rely primarily on European sources? Like, is there any other way it can be done?
Yeah,
is it possible?
Logistically, I can't imagine it being possible, but I also know that there are stories out there. And what I keep thinking of is, if we consider the Burke and Wills expedition, and we all know the terrible story, the last remaining person comes back to Melbourne and dies a little after that. And then a couple of years ago, Ian Clark and Fred Carr put together a volume which has an extraordinary set of interviews with the Aboriginal community from that area, who actually not only remembered but had a descendant of kin. While we had all imagined him dying in his hut, he'd actually fathered a child. And so there's another story to be told. So that's an example, I think, of how you could do it. But in order to do it at the depth that we were doing it for the entire country, I suspect I'd need another couple of lifetimes.
Yes, you probably would. In fact, that sort of leads me to yet another question also, is about the scale of your research and the variety of sources that you use. This was a big job in more ways than one. So for the historians amongst us, and perhaps the viewers as well, if they're not strictly speaking historians, can you talk a bit about how you went about accessing sources? Was there a systematic way of doing that, and particularly putting the zoological ones together with the more broadly historic ones?
I think the zoological ones, the collectors stuff really started to emerge for Penny because she'd been working for a long time on natural history, as it were. And she kept finding these little snippets about somebody talking about, Daniel, for example, Dan did this, or, whoever the Aboriginal person was. So that she kept getting little snippets like that. And she thought this was well worth looking at. In terms of my research, where I start to, I read very, very widely in any given area that I can find. And I think it's really, it's something that I was trained to do because I trained as an archaeologist. So I'm very comfortable with material culture, for example. I have no problems with, looking at museum collections as opposed to just archival materials. Not all historians are as comfortable as that, in my experience, that sometimes they prefer the text, and I tend to be very eclectic. You see, I figured I'm as much a hunter-gatherer and forager as my ancestors were.
That's a nice way of putting it. Emily asks, are there any examples of European collectors in the colonial period recognising Aboriginal people's system of knowledge of fauna, in brackets, rather than, in inverted commas, educating them in the sciences?
Actually, I think Cayley is particularly a good example of that. He is very clear that he is learning from Daniel. He's learning about, and also when they go looking for the koala and they go looking for the platypus, and other naturalists are looking for things like the lungfish. They're learning from the Indigenous knowledge, the faunal knowledge, and they make that fairly clear.
Okay, that just leads me to another question which has come to me via another route. It's not on the comments thing, but it's a question about Indigenous knowledge about megafauna and how much that might have been discussed with European collectors and explorers.
Well, megafauna were extinct for at least 10,000 years prior to Europeans arriving, probably more like 20. So I don't think they would have featured at all. We still do have a megafauna. I mean, people forget that. The big red kangaroo is actually a megafauna.
Right.
But there are, whether or not Aboriginal people hunted megafauna, that's not clear. There's certainly no archaeological evidence that's a good smoking gun for that sort of hypothesis. But what is really interesting is if you take the example of the camels, which have been introduced into Northern Australia, the Northern Land Council wanted to do a culling exercise, and they wanted to go through and get rid of all the camels. And the old ladies said no, that wasn't going to happen because they did not want to see those animals, even though they were a nuisance and they were destroying sacred sites in some cases. They weren't prepared to see those animals slaughtered unless their meat was used in some way. But there's a very famous photograph that Doug Bird took of Martu people going out hunting, and in the foreground are a couple of camels, but they're actually hunting these small buzzard-like birds. There's no, I mean, megafauna has a lot of meat. It may be too much meat for your community, and you don't want it to go to waste and to rot. So there's just, to me, we're just not not yet at a level where we really understand what is going on with the megafauna.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Now, another thing that I became interested in on reading your book is just how broad the various national groups of collectors and explorers were, which I guess I hadn't thought about terribly much before, but they came from all over the place in Europe and perhaps other countries as well.
We really have only been looking at the European examples. So I'm unaware of anyone from Southeast Asia, for example, coming here and collecting, but certainly all over Europe. I mean, from Russia to Germany to Poland to England, like literally all over the place.
Yeah, I found it. So a lot of that stuff that they've collected then is in museums in all over Europe.
Absolutely.
Is that right?
That's right. That's right. And in fact, this collection of material that we're looking at in Berlin at the moment has essentially not been properly catalogued. I mean, we still are. There is still material out there with the original notes from the people who collected it, with their field notes, with their diagrams and the actual specimens, and it's yet to be catalogued properly. So we're going to be looking at digitising it and then doing what I like to call repatriating knowledge. So repatriating that knowledge back to the communities here in Australia from whom it eventuated.
Well, there's another lifetime of work for you, I guess, going to and checking all those collections that haven't been properly catalogued. And the other person I wanted to mention specifically was John Gould, because we all grew up with his beautiful, it has to be said, illustrations. I wonder if you could just expand a bit on John Gould and how he traversed the country and got all his examples for his illustrations.
He did indeed. He was indefatigable. But I think the one that really perhaps touches me even more than Gould is in fact his wife, who drew all those beautiful images that we're so familiar with. That's her work, and which I feel he may have claimed, unfairly claimed. And she certainly often travelled with him despite, morning sickness and all sorts of things. I mean, it really is an astonishing. I mean, she's the one I want to see the movie made about.
Yes, that'd be great, actually, wouldn't it?
It sure would.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I'm sort of, I'm aware of her, but, we all grew up with the Book of Birds that, I suppose it was almost a standard text for people of a certain generation. I'm not sure how widely it's accessed these days, but one is unfailingly moved by the beauty of the illustrations.
Oh, they're beautiful. They're beautiful, and again, we are so incredibly fortunate that our National Library has copies of these, the originals. Just superb.
Yes. Good on the National Library. Long may it live. I think I'm probably coming to the end of my question. I was very pleased about the optimistic winding up in the book, and then you've elaborated on it more in another way in your talk. But still, there's a hell of a lot that's disappeared. A hell of a lot of human beings have disappeared, and a hell of a lot of animals. How do you feel about the future in general on that kind of thing? We do, what you're talking about is small patches, very small patches of optimism.
It is, but I'm a classically glasses half full person. I always am. I'm always. My motto is pessimism is self-fulfilling prophecy. So
right.
I'm never gonna be the pessimist. We can sit here and we can lament, and there are some terrible things that have happened, and there are times when I'm working on material that is so distressing and so gut-wrenching and painful that I have to get up and walk away. But I truly believe in the importance of this work. This work is so important. It is vitally important that every person in Australia understands this is the history of our country, and we all have a stake in it, every one of us.
Well, the Black Earth History Forum applauds you for that position. It's been a lovely talk. We've just got another question that's just come in. It says, in your new project on invasive species, are you looking at how some animals have become part of Indigenous kinship systems? I've heard about kitty cat dreaming, which perhaps is what you already alluded to, and she's also heard about baba dreaming.
Yes, but
dreaming.
both of those things, both of those things are definitely part of what we're interested in. How these introduced animals become incorporated into the cosmological, spiritual, and totemic life of the communities.
Do you know of any others? Introduced species?
The kitty cat, the cats are the main one, definitely. And what's really interesting there is we suspect that those communities that have incorporated kitty cats into, they call them kitty cats, into their cosmology are the ones that the spotted quoll have been removed from, because the spotted quoll was called cat dreaming. And we think that what's happened is, as the spotted quoll has become often extinct, or at least regionally extinct, the kitty cat has taken over its place within the framework of the dreaming.
And anything further about the sheep dreaming, baba dreaming?
I don't know the baba dreaming, so I'll have to look into that one.
It sounds like fun. And what about introduced dogs? I mean, as opposed to dingoes. Have they been domesticated dogs like we, like your two little dogs?
But basically every Aboriginal person I know is mad about dogs. And dogs, certainly in the 19th century, Aboriginal women in particular took dogs on very quickly. Dogs became a hunting companion and all the rest. It's rare for dogs to go feral in the way that cats can. I mean, they can, obviously, but it's much rarer.
Right. So they're primarily, that function is domestic.
Domestic, yeah.
Okay. I think we might wind up there. Thank you very much for giving us your time and attention today, Lynette. I hope you're happy with the audience and the questions. We have a really terrific audience who really love your kind of history. So we really appreciate you making the time to do this for us. Just before you disappear, I want to thank Dr. Emily O'Gorman, who is a member of the Blackheath History Forum's committee. Here she comes on screen, and she's handled all the tech side of things today, and in the lead up to today. It's not just today that she manages all of this out of her study in Lura, and all of this is in spite of her very demanding day job as a senior lecturer specialising in environmental and cultural history at Macquarie University. So thank you very much, Emily. We couldn't do any of this without you. And Kate O'Neill, who also does a lot of the techie side. Now, I just want to tell everybody a little bit about what we're doing next time. Our next talk will be at 4 o'clock on Saturday, October the 31st. We're very delighted to be hosting Patrick Mullins, who is the author of the multiple award-winning Tiberius with a Telephone, a biography of once Australian Prime Minister Billy McMahon. If you're old enough to remember Billy McMahon and are thinking, why would anyone write his biography? Think again. This book has won both the National Biography Award and the non-fiction category in the New South Wales Premier's Literary Awards, and with good reason. It's funny, informative, and essential reading for anyone interested in Australian political life. Patrick brings fresh and very young eyes to a subject that most of us older people ever thought to consider. And I recommend that you read it or become familiar with it before the talk in a fortnight's time. So please join us on October the 31st at 4 o'clock for Patrick's talk. And thank you very much again, Lynette. And goodbye, everyone from Blackheath. See you next time.